Today's guest on the Winning Teams podcast is somebody I have been so excited to actually get on the show. I've been trying to get him for some time, but because of demands on his time, it has been a challenge, but I'm delighted to say that he's here with us. He is the wonderful, wonderful, wonderful author Nir Eyal, who is the author of Indistractable. And if you have not read Indistractable, then I highly recommend that you do so. It is a fantastic read. It has taken him a number of years to write it. It is hugely research-based. So it really, really does help us to become less distracted than we normally are in our lives. So who is it for? Well, it's for people who get distracted. So that is probably just about everybody on the planet. And we know that getting distracted is a huge time stealer and takes us away from, what we actually want to achieve. And in the book, Nir talks about motivation. He's got a real take on motivation that you'll find fascinating. But he also gives us strategies to help us to minimize or remove distractions from our lives, but really help us to manage those distractions. And also recognizing that while we all blame distractions, but actually, in fact, distractions are something that we choose. But he also talks about our own beliefs about ourselves and how those limiting beliefs really do negatively impact our performance. So sit back and enjoy. And also in the show notes, you will see a load of links that Nir has very, very kindly given to us that would be a huge addition to the book and would really enrich the experience. So as I said, sit back and enjoy this great, great interview with Nir Eyal. This is a great honor for me to have you on. As I said to you a few minutes ago, Indistractable is really my favorite book of 2019. So I am delighted to have you here on the show. I think it's a fantastic book. I think it's got a great application for so many people, and I'm thrilled that you're here to share it with us.
John, that's a huge compliment. Thank you so much. That means the world to me. I spent 5 years on this book, and I really wrote it for me first and foremost because I was struggling with this problem, and to see that other people have benefited from it and adopted these tactics in their own life means so much. Thank you for that.
No, it's great. I loved the subheading, which is how to control your attention and choose your life. Because, and I'd love you just to elaborate on that, because really what you're saying is that the fact that what you pay attention to determines the life you end up with. Is that really what was in your head when you were writing that subtitle?
Absolutely. And I think that becoming indistractable is truly the skill of the century, that this is a macro skill that we need to adopt. Because look, the world, if you think the world is distracting now, just wait a few years. It's only going to become more distracting as technology becomes more pervasive and more persuasive. There will be increasing tolls on our attention and our time. And so I really think that there will be a bifurcation between people who decide for themselves, no, I am the kind of person who controls their attention, who controls their time, who controls their life, or the kind of people who unfortunately will be left behind and allow their time and attention to be controlled by other people. And so that's really what the book is about, is how do we make sure that we live with personal integrity, we do what it is that we say we are going to do, because in all facets of our life, this is a critical macro skill, whether it's in the workplace. We know that to do our best work, we have to be able to focus. When it comes to our relationships, we know that we are suffering through this loneliness epidemic these days. And part of the reason is that we can't form close relationships if we're busy looking at our devices. And when it comes to our children, what kind of example are we setting if what they see of us is the top of our heads as we're busy looking at our screens? And so just to be clear, I'm not technophobic. I'm not a Luddite. I love these technologies. I'm not going to tell you to go on a digital detox or to stop using social media. That's not what I'm going to tell you at all. I love these devices. And I believe, I'm very optimistic, if we know how to use them correctly, we can get the best out of these tools without letting them get the best of us.
Yeah, because I think it's interesting. You were making the point in the book, and it just it struck me when, in conversations with people, when I was reading and after reading the book, when people say, oh, it's social media that's the cause of our distraction. It's technology. And it's not. I mean, we're the people that get distracted. It's not the technology. So blaming the technology is kind of a cop out, because
it absolutely is
from ourselves.
That's right. And it's such an easy excuse, right? It's such a knee-jerk reaction. And I'll be honest with you, I actually thought that was the case as well. When I first started researching this topic, I did have this knee-jerk reaction of saying, well, it must be the technology distracting me, because that is the medium of distraction. But the more I studied the problem, I learned that not only is distraction nothing new, that in fact Plato talked about distraction 2,500 years ago, right? Well before the iPhone and Facebook, people were talking about how distracting the world was. And so not only is distraction not a new problem, even when I got rid of the technology, right? I actually did what many people think you should do, get rid of the technology, go on a digital detox. Even when I did that, I still got distracted. I would say, oh, well, maybe I'll read one of these books on the shelf because there might be something, relevant to my work, or maybe I'll clean up my desk, or let me take out the trash real quick. And I would still get distracted because it's not the root cause of the problem.
I loved your comment in it that you can't be distracted if you don't know what you're being distracted from.
Right.
And I think that was really powerful, because I suppose really what that means is that somebody without a clear plan can't really be distracted, can they?
That's right. And so it's a great place to start, actually, with what do we mean when we use this term distraction. So I think the best way to understand distraction is to understand the opposite of distraction. The opposite of distraction is not focus. The opposite of distraction, if you look at the etymology of the words, is traction. That traction and distraction both come from the same Latin root, trahare, which means to pull, and they both end in the same 6 letters, A-C-T-I-O-N. That spells action. So traction is any action that you take that pulls you towards what you want to do, things that you do with intent. The opposite of traction is distraction, anything that pulls you away from what you plan to do, anything that you are not doing with intent. So this is really important, because what it tells us is that essentially anything can be a distraction and anything can be traction, based on whether we plan on it or whether it's something that we do impulsively, whether it's something that we'll later regret because it's not what we plan to do. And so you're exactly right. You cannot call something a distraction unless you know what you got distracted from. Turns out most people don't keep any sort of a calendar. They don't keep any sort of a schedule. And so if your day is full of white space, well, then everything is a distraction, right? Because you didn't decide for yourself what you want to do with your time. And maybe that was something you could do in decades past. But look, in this decade, that will no longer be an option, that there are just too many places to grab your attention. There's too much interesting content out there, frankly, that is vying for your attention and your time. And so if you don't decide in advance how you want to spend your time, your boss is going to eat up your schedule. The social media companies are going to eat up your schedule. Your kids, the news, something is going to eat up your time and attention unless you decide in advance how you want to spend your time.
So, I mean, it does kind of predetermine that we need to have kind of objectives and goals and plans to actually do things in order to allow ourselves to get distracted. But you talk about motivation. And and I really loved that when you're talking about that in the book, because you're saying that motivation is what drives us to do something magnificent, but you also say it's less to do with pleasure than we thought, because
right.
We all kind of think as motivating as to doing something great and good and wonderful, right? But your philosophy, your belief is that it's more kind of to take us further away from pain.
That's exactly right. Yeah, that if we look at the root of why we do what we do, not just why do we get distracted, right? Plato's 2,500-year-old question of why do we act against our better interest? Why, despite the fact that we know what to do, why don't we just do it, right? And in this day and age, I think that's a more pertinent question than ever, because there is no longer an information gap. Who doesn't basically know what to do? If you want to get in shape, who doesn't know basically how to get in shape? Who doesn't know that to do good work, you have to actually do the work, even the hard stuff? Who doesn't basically know how to have better relationships? You have to be fully present with people. We know this stuff. And if you don't know the answer, Google it. It's all there for you. The question is not that is not what do we do? The question is, why don't we do the things we know we should? And so to answer that question, we have to go a layer deeper. to ask ourselves, why do we do everything that we do? And most people, if you ask them what's the nature of motivation, they will give you some version of carrots and sticks, right? That everything we do is about the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. This is called Freud's pleasure principle. Turns out that it's not exactly accurate. That neurologically speaking, what is happening in the brain that drives human motivation is not about the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain, but in fact, it's pain all the way down. That everything we do is about the desire to escape discomfort. This is called a homeostatic response. Physiologically, we feel this every day, right? If you go outside and you feel cold, you put on a jacket. If you feel hungry, if you feel hunger pangs, you eat. And so everything we do is about the desire to escape this physiological discomfort. But the same holds true with our psychological discomfort. So, for example, when we're feeling lonely, we might check Facebook. When we're bored, we Google. When we're uncertain, we Google. If we're bored, we might look at the sports scores. We might check Reddit or Pinterest. If we don't want to think about our own problems, we want to think about somebody else's problems, we turn on the news. So what we have to understand that the root cause of all distraction are these uncomfortable emotional states, what I call internal triggers. And it turns out from my 5 years of research on this topic that the vast majority of what distracts us throughout the day is not the external triggers. It's not the pings and dings and things that we blame outside of us. But in fact, most distraction starts from within. And if we don't tackle those internal triggers first and foremost, we will always become distracted by one thing or another.
I want to come on to those 4 triggers because I think you've got a great kind of 4-step process to talk about that. But when we talk about this, about pain and pleasure and the motivation, does that mean that we're, because we kind of think that our motivation is, achieving our goals to get something pleasurable or something that is, that will bring pleasure to us. Does that mean that we're being delusional about our goals, that our goals are actually going to bring us to something, to some great nirvana?
In a way we are. So there's a phenomenon that we call hedonic adaptation, which shows that even when something really good happens to us or something bad happens to us, we tend to gravitate towards our baseline level of happiness. So they've done studies on people who win the lottery. They're very, very happy at first, but then they kind of quickly go back down to baseline level of happiness. Or people who have been injured and become paralyzed. They're very disappointed at first, but then they again recover to their baseline level of happiness. And so in a way, we are tricking ourselves if we think that when we get to some magical place, then we'll be happy, then we'll be satisfied. And I think in some ways, the self-help industry perpetuates this myth to our detriment. That one of the things that drives me crazy these days about the self-help personal development industry is that many times people feed this message that we're supposed to be happy all the time, that happiness should be our perpetual goal in a way. It's not so much the happiness as the pursuit of the happiness that we should look for. Because if you think about it, looking to be in that happy state perpetually, and I think what's pernicious about this is that people think, well, if I'm not happy, if I'm not satisfied all the time, there's something wrong with me, that I need to fix something. And nothing could be further from the truth because, feeling bad is not bad. That is part of the human condition. If you think about it from an evolutionary basis, if there was ever a species, a sect of Homo sapiens, a tribe of people who were happy and satisfied all the time, our ancestors probably killed and ate them, right? Because that would not be a beneficial evolutionary trait. We would want a species to desire, to crave, to thirst for more. That's what keeps us creating, inventing, and improving our lot in life. The question, therefore, is that we shouldn't squash these uncomfortable emotional triggers. We should harvest them. We should utilize them so that we use them to help us move towards traction rather than distraction.
Yeah, because I loved the quote you have, which said, if satisfaction and pleasure were permanent, there might be little incentive to continue seeking benefits or advancement. And that's right. Actually true, isn't it? Because it's going back to what you're saying, is that the old principle that, okay, someday, honey, if we have the house on the hill or we've $1 million in the bank account or we have the yacht in Saint-Tropez, then I'd be happy. But in the meantime, I'm miserable, right?
Right.
And what you're saying is that you've got to be able to enjoy the journey to achieve it, but that the achievement it just sets the new baseline.
Exactly. And so this is a big reason why we tend to constantly get distracted, how our neural hardwiring in many ways predisposes us to distractions, because we never are satisfied for long. And that's not something we necessarily want to fight. It's something we will have to understand, that is a beneficial evolutionary trait. It keeps us working. It keeps us striving. It keeps us improving the lives of others as well as ourselves by harvesting and utilizing those internal triggers. It's not necessarily a bad thing.
Okay. You've got a great, I mean, I was going to say simple as opposed to easy, but you've got 4 key strategies to really help us do it. And I just think that, the way you talk about it, it just makes so much sense, the way you talk about it. But also, the 4 strategies kind of give you the tool. I'd love you to just elaborate on those 4 key strategies, because they are just brilliant.
Thank you. So we talked about, if you can imagine a number line, the best way to visualize this, it's in the book, there's a graphic, but if you're listening, the best way to visualize it is to think of a horizontal line with 2 arrows pointing outwards. And to the right, you have traction, right? The actions that we take that pull us towards what we want. Then to the opposite side, we have distraction, the opposite of traction. So now you've got this horizontal line. Now what I want you to do is to bisect that line with a vertical line. So you've got these 2 lines bisecting. And so kind of the north and south represent our triggers. We have what's called the external triggers, the things in our environment that prompt us towards traction or distraction. And then we have the internal triggers, what we just talked about, those uncomfortable emotional states. So now we can kind of work our way around these 4 compass points to unveil the 4 strategies we can use to become indistractable. The most important first step is to master the internal triggers, to understand what it is driving us towards distraction. If we don't master those internal triggers, these uncomfortable emotional states, we will always succumb to one distraction or another. So in the book, I give a series of different strategies that you can use. Everything is research-based. It comes from acceptance and commitment therapy. It comes from the latest research. These aren't some, pet hypotheses that I came up with. I spent 5 years researching this book. And so everything has been published in some kind of peer-reviewed journal. There's 20 pages of citations. And there's very practical steps. None of them involve meditation, just so you know. Not that I'm opposed to meditation, but it seems like every book on this topic just tells you to meditate your problems away. And if it works for you, great. I needed more, okay? I needed something else besides meditation. I'd heard that advice 1,000 times. There's more that you can do than just to try and meditate your problems away. So we can reimagine the trigger, we can reimagine the task, we can reimagine the temperament, and I tell you exactly how to do that. The second big step, now we're moving our way to the second step. The second step is to make time for traction. So it turns out, in order to make sure we do what we say we're going to do, we have to plan that time in advance. And so I teach you how to use a technique called time boxing. Psychologists call this making an implementation intention, just a fancy way of saying you're going to plan out what you're going to do and when you're going to do it. Very, very effective technique. Hundreds of studies have validated how effective this technique is. It's very easy to start, and it will change your life. It'll change your work life. It'll change your home life. It is such a simple thing that you can do. In fact, I'll give you a link for the show notes. I created this free online tool that people can use to get started. Totally free. You don't have to register. No email required. Just a very simple calendar template to help you plan your day, so that for every minute of the day, you will know the difference between what is traction and what is distraction for that period of time. Very, very important technique. And then what you want to do is you want to synchronize your schedule. This is something that hasn't been published anywhere else, about how do you coordinate with your boss, your coworker, your spouse, for example, to make sure that you synchronize your schedule so that you can do what it is you said you're going to do. So that's the second step. The third step is to hack back the external triggers. In the computer science community, to hack means to gain unauthorized access to something. And so we think about these tech companies hacking our attention. And what I argue is, well, guess what? We can hack back, right? They're not so smart. There's all kinds of things that we can do, as powerful as their algorithms are, as much as we love to vilify them. Turns out there's some very simple things that we can do to hack back our technology in ways that they can't do anything about. For example, simple things like turning off notifications that don't serve us, rearranging how we use our laptops, our computer interfaces. That's kind of the kindergarten stuff. That's super easy. But what about all the other places that external triggers can distract us? For example, what about email? What about meetings? Oh my goodness, how much time do we spend in pointless meetings? It turns out that we can hack back the external triggers in these various environments to make sure that we are not led to distraction. And then the fourth and final step, and this is kind of the fail-safe, this is what we do last after we've done the other three steps, is to prevent distraction with pacts. Pacts are these pre-commitments that we can make with ourselves or with other people to make sure that if we are tempted towards distraction, we have a backstop. We have some kind of fail-safe to make sure that we don't do something we later regret, that we don't get distracted. And there are three types of these pacts. We have what's called an effort pact, which is some kind of piece of friction, something that prevents us from doing something we later regret, prevents us from getting distracted. We have a price pact, which is where there's some kind of monetary disincentive to getting distracted. And then finally, there's what we call an identity pact, which I think is the most interesting of the three. An identity pact leverages the psychology of identity, of some kind of self-image, in many ways can help us stay true to what we say we're going to do. And so for this part of the book, I actually did quite a bit of research into the psychology of religion. And it turns out that when people have a particular moniker they use to call themselves, that they identify with, this is a huge, a very effective tool for making sure we stay on track. For example, if someone calls themselves an observant Muslim or a devout Christian, they become much more likely to stay on the path. And you can even see this when it comes to vegetarians, right? A vegetarian doesn't wake up in the morning and say, oh, I think I want some bacon for breakfast. No, a vegetarian does not eat meat. It's what they do because it's who they are. So this is why I called the book Indistractable, because I want to start a movement, an identity of people who say, this is who I am. I am indistractable. Yeah, maybe I do a few odd things, right? Maybe I do things that are a little bit unconventional, but is it any more unusual than someone who wears particular religious garb or who eats an unusual diet? No, this is who I am. And the good news is that, we've been here before. I remember when I was growing up in the 1980s, people would walk into our home and just light up a cigarette. That's what people did back then. They didn't even ask. They just expected. If you didn't have an ashtray, that was considered very rude. You had to have an ashtray ready because people just expected to smoke. Well, today, nobody does that, right? That would be considered very rude to smoke in someone's living room. Can you imagine such a thing? Well, what changed? Of course, there were regulations, but no regulation ever made it illegal to smoke in someone's home. What happened was people stood up and say, no, we are non-smokers. If you'd like to smoke, please go outside. And I remember when my mom, my parents didn't smoke, and when they told someone for the first time, we're non-smokers, please smoke outside, oh, they were very offended. How could you ask such a thing? And of course, now it's commonplace. So what I think we need to do is to spread what's called social antibodies. We need people to stand up and say, look, there's a time and a place to use our devices, and there's a time and a place not to use our devices. And by becoming indistractable, by having that identity, that moniker that we use to call ourselves a particular a noun to become indistractable, this is how we not only change ourselves, I think it's how we change greater society.
It's brilliant. One of the things that I really enjoyed reading was this kind of to understand when I'm getting distracted. When are the times that I'm getting distracted? And you talk about, what is the discomfort that precedes the distraction? Can you elaborate on that? Because I just thought that was very useful in terms of beginning to understand is when am I likely to get distracted, because there's a pattern to it, isn't there? I mean, it tends to be, it'll be different for different people, but we all have our own pattern. Maybe could you just elaborate on that?
Sure. So there's a Paulo Coelho quote who he said that a mistake repeated more than once is a decision. And I think when it comes to distraction, many of us, at least I used to before I went down this path of research, I would keep getting distracted by the same things day after day after day. And so that's crazy. That's insanity. Why do we let ourselves continue to be distracted by the same things? It turns out that every distraction only has one of three potential causes. Either it's a planning problem, an external trigger, or an internal trigger. It can only be one of those three things. And so what I include in the book is a distraction tracker. And what you do is when you go off track, when you find yourself doing something that you didn't intend to do, you're just going to write down that distraction and try and figure out the cause. Not right away. The cause, what you want to do is try and get back on that task. But later on, you're going to reassess, why did I get distracted? Of those 3 reasons, was it because I didn't plan enough time for that activity? Was it because there was some kind of external trigger, something outside of me distracted me? Or most likely, the majority of the time, it typically tends to be an internal trigger. Was I feeling bored, lonesome, uncertain, fatigued, anxious? What was that internal trigger? And then what you're going to do is to ask yourself, how can I make sure I have the tools in my toolkit to make sure the next time that distraction rears its ugly head, how can I make sure that I can not give in to that distraction when the time comes by using the techniques I describe in the book?
Okay. And you also talk about kind of beware of those liminal moments of transitioning from one to the other, because there is kind of the in some areas kind of accepted, well, if I'm doing loads of different things and I kind of have it all ordered, but there is that kind of loss of time from transitioning from one to the other that is kind of, is not recognized in many places. And I thought that you talked about it very well, because it's kind of a form of distraction, isn't it? I mean, not very often it wouldn't be described as distraction, but it is a form of distraction, isn't it?
Absolutely. Distraction is very tricky. Distraction tricks you into thinking that what you're doing is what you intend to do, even when it's not. I mean, for me, a great example would be, I would say to myself, okay, now I'm going to sit down. I'm going to work on that big project. I'm going to stop procrastinating. I'm going to do that thing that I intend to do. Here I go. I'm going to get to work right after I check email. Right, right after I tick off those few easy tasks on my to-do list real quick. And I would argue that those things are just as much of a distraction as checking Facebook, right? That if it's not what you plan to do, what you're doing, even if you say, okay, email is productive, email is something I have to do anyway. Well, if that's not what you plan to do for that given period of time, that is just as much of a distraction, because you are prioritizing the urgent at the expense of the important. And if you don't find ways to make sure you do what it is you say you're going to do in advance, you're constantly going to be working on these urgent tasks and never get to the stuff that's really important, that's imperative for your business, for your life. These things have to get done when you say you're going to do them. And so one of the things that oftentimes tricks us is what I call these liminal moments, these times between times that we have to be very careful of. So it might look something like, I just came back from a meeting, and on my way to my desk, I'm checking email. And then when I sit down at my desk, I keep checking email. 15, 20 minutes later, now I'm off task from what I intended to do at that time. Another great example that's much more dangerous is I'm at a red light and I'm checking email real quick. I think I'm being productive by using my time wisely. And then the light turns green, and now I'm still on my phone. And of course, that can have life-threatening consequences. So what we want to do is to be very careful of those liminal moments, and again, use them with intent.
Yeah, I must say that after reading the book, because I must say I have been very guilty of that. I do the planning for the day and all of that, and then I sit down and I open the laptop and I say, I just have a quick look at email. Right.
Yeah.
Since I've read that, every time I do that, I think, oh, hang on a second. You're functioning as my conscience when it comes to email in that regard. Just want to move on in terms to I think it's chapter 8, where you're talking about reimagining your temperament. And you quoted, which Carol Dweck, who I'd be a big fan of, where she said ego depletion was observed only in those who believed that willpower is a limited resource, which is a great line. And I think what you're saying is that how we think, our mindset has such an impact upon our achievements, and how we talk to ourselves is so powerful. I suppose my question is that how do we actually manage that self-talk?
Yeah, that's a great question. But let me back up a bit to explain that study, because I think it's such a fascinating example of how the way we speak to ourselves can have a profound impact on our performance. Many people in the personal productivity community, they think, okay, that's just fluffy stuff. How important can it be? But let me give you a very concrete example. So a few years ago, there was this theory that we called ego depletion. And ego depletion says that you run out of willpower, kind of like gas in a gas tank. And there were actually some studies that show that this was the case. Unfortunately, these studies didn't replicate. that this idea that you run out of willpower, that it's a limited resource, turns out to be not true, at least as far as we know from the scientific literature, that they could not replicate these studies, except for one group of people. There was one group of people who did exemplify ego depletion. They really did run out of willpower like gas in a gas tank. And those people, as you mentioned, those people were people who believed that willpower was a limited resource. So it was only if you believed, oh, I'm spent, I've got none left, right? I've had a really hard day at work. I can't not give in to that ice cream and distraction, whatever it might be. Those were the people who exemplified this trait, and it was only because they believed it was true. And I think we see something very similar happening today when we hear from people who say, oh, technology is hijacking my brain. It's addicting everyone. My kids, they won't get off the computer because of how addictive the technology is. Well, when we believe this stuff, it actually makes it true. It's called learned helplessness. And so we have to fight that mentality because we are much, much more powerful than we realize.
But it's that self-talk it's hard to control, isn't it? I mean, do you have any strategies for people to how they actually can manage that self-talk?
Yes. So the best thing you can do, it turns out, is utilize self-compassion. And so self-compassion, it turns out people who are more self-compassionate are much more likely to achieve their long-term goals. And so in my life, this really rang true because, if you had a microphone inside my head and you could hear how I talk to myself, you would think I was a bully, right? I would tell myself how, you see, you're lazy, or you're not cut out for this, or you're no good at this, or, I would constantly tell myself this negative self-talk. And in fact, it turns out that negative self-talk makes things a lot worse. We talked about those internal triggers. Well, it turns out that people who shame themselves, as I used to do, we make ourselves feel even worse when we stir up more of those internal triggers. And what do we do when we feel worse, when we feel more of those internal triggers? We look for relief from, ironically, distraction, to take our mind off of that shame. And so we don't want to be shamers. That's not very helpful. Conversely, we don't want to be what we call blamers. The blamers, they don't blame themselves. They blame something outside themselves. They say, oh, it's the tech companies. It's this modern world doing this to me. They blame stuff outside themselves. That's not productive because they can't do anything about that stuff, right? That's all outside of themselves. So we don't want to be blamers. We don't want to be shamers. We want to be what we call claimers. Claimers claim responsibility for these actions. You didn't invent Facebook. You didn't invent the iPhone. You didn't invent email. You didn't invent these things. They're not your fault, but they are your responsibility. Your responsibility to do something productive in response to those uncomfortable sensations. You can't affect how you feel. You can only change how you respond to those sensations. And so the best piece of advice turns out to be to talk to yourself the way we would talk to a good friend. And so when we do get into these moments where we feel like we're off track and we're trying to reassess our temperament, what we want to do is to really ask ourselves, look, if a good friend came to me and said, you know what, I find myself going off track and I'm having trouble here with this task, would we tell them that they're lazy, that they're incompetent, that they're an imposter? No, not if we were a good friend. We would talk to them with compassion. And so that's the best piece of advice, is to talk to ourselves the way we would talk to a good friend in order to cultivate the self-compassion that allows us to rationally look at the distraction and find ways to overcome it.
It's what you say about claiming responsibility. I mean, that really is what it's so much about, isn't it? About claiming responsibility about what we do, what we think about, how we behave, how we spend our time. And I mean, I know you actually talk a bit, and we don't have the time to talk about it today, but you talk in the book about that in many ways we're about all of the assets that we have in our life. We actually invest quite a bit of time and money in protecting them, but our time we're a little bit careless with, which is
that's exactly right.
Yeah,
that's exactly right.
Responsibility. Nir, listen, this has been fantastic. I've loved it. We have scratched the surface of the book because there is so much in there, and we could go on for a couple of hours. But I would highly recommend to anyone to actually go and get the book. and everything will be in the show notes too about that. But it is a fantastic read, and something I find I keep going back to it to actually reference pieces that are in there because I've highlighted so much of it. But where can people get in touch with you, Nir?
Absolutely, yeah. So my website is nirandfar.com. Nir is spelled like my first name, N-I-R, so that's N-I-R and far.com. And if you want more information on the book specifically, that's at indistractable.com. It's spelled I-N, the word distract, A-B-L-E. And you can find all kinds of resources there. There's actually an 80-page workbook that's complimentary that we couldn't fit into the final edition of the book, but you can get that online for free. And also, if you do end up buying the book, make sure that you keep your order number, whether you buy it from a local bookstore or Amazon. Just keep your order number. If you go to indistractable.com, there's actually a video course that you can get if you enter in that order number. So make sure you keep that handy. And that's all at indistractable.com.
Well, that is fantastic. And by the way, I just think that the nirandfar.com, I think it's one of the most cleverest website names that I've come across. Nir, thank you so much for coming along today. It's been a huge pleasure and honor to have you. It's been great to talk to you, and thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and a little bit of what's in the book with us today.
My pleasure, John. Thank you very much for having me.